So let's take a moment maybe just to wave to each other, just like hello. If you have it off, that's fine. Good. Okay. So let's get going. Nice to see you all. I feel like we're getting to know each other even at this distance. The format for today will be a teaching, experience, feedback from the experience, a break, then teaching, experience, feedback from the experience, and the end. So let's start just with a moment of just kind of tuning into ourselves. Nothing special, but just allowing your attention to come down into your body a bit. Just feeling yourself from the inside and allowing your sense of I to kind of drift down a little bit deeper into your body. Maybe into the throat or the chest or the stomach or abdomen. So maybe just getting a sense that your I also comes from down in there. And maybe just taking a moment to see if you could bring to yourself just a space of acceptance. That it's okay to be you the way you are this morning. Any aspect of yourself you might be aware of, maybe see if you can welcome it and allow that to be there. It can just quietly be with you. Nobody else even knows. Just expanding your sense of self a little bit to include everything that's there, to be as inclusive as possible. Okay. So when you feel ready, you can just come back and we'll start. Okay, so I want to talk about this topic of right relationship. My intention will be to read some points, but read them really slowly. So I'm hoping you can kind of get a sense inside of yourself of what my words are pointing to. I want to just say at the beginning that right relationship is not in the sense of a judgment coming from the outside. It's not like you're getting it right. It's not that kind of right. It's not right because I say it's the right kind of relationship or somebody else does. It's a rightness that is a discernment that comes from your own experiencing, that it feels right inside of you. It's that kind of rightness. So like everything in focusing, this is essentially empirical. It's really what works for you. Focusing is deeply empirical and phenomenological, and I'm using those words experientially to mean based entirely upon your experiencing and based entirely upon what really is as it is from itself, rather than how we perceive it or our assumptions about it or our interpretations about it. So focusing has those qualities, empirical in the sense of based upon experience, and phenomenological in that it's really paying attention to what is. So some of the things that I say, you might not agree or you might not believe them. It's good not to believe what I say. You only want to believe what you have experienced from inside of yourself. So anything that I say, you can take it into your own experiencing, and as soon as you do that, you will probably find your own way of saying it, or at least some elaboration of what I've said. And that's important. That's something that you could bring in, add into the teaching, add into the practice of focusing that may not be there at all at the moment. So it's important to really harvest what comes back from you when you try any of the things that are suggested, because what comes back from you will be more refined. So the first thing that I want to say is very basic, and then I'd like to follow that with a short and simple practice. So the first thing is about starting in the right place. At least that's what I'm calling it. If you can be in so-called right relationship with your bodily experiencing, often you will find that that is enough. That is all that is needed for the experience itself to become self-propelled, to kind of come alive and start to process itself. Nothing else is needed but that right relationship. So I want to give a little summary, and then I want to go into this idea of starting in the right place. This is a summary of what I'm going to say. I can give you the notes later if anybody wants them, so you don't have to worry about that. Relationship equals space or distance plus connection or contact. So our awareness makes the space. It might even be that our awareness or our consciousness or our attention actually is space. That space and awareness may in fact be two words for the same thing. But we mean a sense of space that has a kind of a soft quality to it. It's not the usual kind of attention that we bring to ourselves that can be at least slightly doubting or critical or negative or pushy, or telling ourselves how to be rather than asking ourselves how we really are. It's not that kind of space or attention. The relationship that we need includes time or patience. It has that kind of quality to it. And you will probably find that most of us are often at least a little bit impatient with ourselves. So this is a kind of a correction if we can bring this other kind of attitude to our own experiencing. The feeling inside usually needs to feel that we have time for it to unfold at its own pace, not at our pace. It has its own sense of timing. And when we focus, a different sense of time often emerges. A feeling of experiential time in which a minute can seem very, very long, or an hour can pass very quickly. The process itself seems to create its own experience of time when we're focusing. And then there's a little aside here. No, I'm not going to read that. The tone and the attitude is the other part of the relationship. The kind of attention that we're offering, it needs to be sincere. It needs to be honest. You can't, unfortunately, fake it. Because the felt sense also is you, and it knows it. So it just doesn't work to lie to yourself. Unfortunately, it would be great if it did work, but it doesn't. So if compassion, which is a word that I would often use, if that kind of attitude of compassion, it feels like too much to ask, maybe openness is possible. Or maybe non-judgmental is possible. It has to be something you can actually offer honestly. And if not, then we need to back up and offer a relationship to the part that can't be compassionate. It's rushing or judging, whatever. And that's about kind of finding the right place to start, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. So it needs to feel real. It can't be just acting or posing as compassionate. That just won't work. It can't be going through the motions of being non-judgmental. It has to actually be non-judgmental. So you need to offer the kind of relationship that will allow the bodily feeling to feel safe enough to tell you the truth. It's sitting there implying something, some truth about some situation, some truth about your stance in some situation in your life, something like that. You need to offer the kind of relationship that will allow the felt sense to feel safe enough to tell you the truth. Then if it's what I'm calling a right relationship, you in turn will want to hear its truth and have that quality that it will want to tell you the truth, partly because with your attention, you're actually willing to hear it, wanting to hear it. It may want to inform you of something that's very different from your point of view, the way you're understanding a situation, or something that your theories about life might tell you. It might want to tell you something very different than all of that. If the truth is being told, and of course the truth in that moment, 5 minutes later, it might be a very, very different truth, so we're not holding on to truth as some everlasting thing. But if the truth in that moment is being told and being heard by you, being received, you'll feel the easing in your body. That's our guide. So it's like some tension releases because that truth is being told and heard, and something in you kind of lets go. So that's our guide. Is that kind of slight easing, letting go, expanding. That's what we're always looking for, even if it makes no sense to us, even if what comes is the opposite of what we expected. If it comes with that easing, then we know that in some way we're on the right track. It doesn't mean that what just came is the whole story. That's not true, because then another step will come, and another, and another. We can trust that track, even though we may not want to act upon or fully take as an answer any one step along the track. So Finding the right place to start. So this is the first basic thing I'd like us to practice. I want to say just a little bit about it. And I'm not exactly sure how to say this, so I'm hoping that I can get this across. Often we start in the middle of the story when we're with ourselves. But we need to take a step back to actually start at the beginning or at the edge of what's happening. It quickly becomes difficult if you try to focus from within a part of yourself. This is getting back to the facilitative language that was taught yesterday. As you stay with the process, you may soon begin to notice a kind of tension or pushing, or the body getting a little bit tight as it tries a little bit too hard, or puts in too much effort, or strains against something as it tries to attend to something else. There's that kind of slight unease. If you feel that, it can mean that you're identified with a part of yourself, and you're not really in that open space of just being present. That open space feels more relaxing. It could be that a subtle agenda has begun to form, and that usually becomes more noticeable the longer you stay with a feeling in your body. So it can be very useful to take the time at the beginning of your session to find the right place to start, to find the end of the thread, so to speak. So you're not kind of halfway down the story and halfway through the session having to back up again. So there could be endless ways of doing that, but one way of doing that is to bring your attention into the body and to notice how much do you need to back up in order to be the space that can be present to all that's there. So how much do you need to back up in order to feel that now you are the space of attention that is bigger than everything else that's there? You're not inside of anything, you're with it all. So how much do you need to expand so that you're not inside of anything, but instead you can feel that you're bigger than anything you're experiencing? Your awareness becomes this expansive body within which feelings arise. It is more than, and sometimes can be much bigger than, the physiological body. So you're not stuck within the skin. You can have your awareness around yourself if it needs to be that big. Usually the feeling becomes more subtle as you back up and just be the space around it. That's an indication you're beginning to sense all of it instead of a part of it while still inside some other part of it. The subtler feeling is the felt sense. That's when you're being with all of it at once. So from Jenlin's point of view, that means that you are now with the whole life situation, rather than trying to focus while still inside of it in some way. So that's the first thing about just trying to find the right place to start, so that you can sense that you can have this kind of open attention towards whatever it is you're attending to. That the attention itself isn't somehow filled with something, an agenda or something else. If it is, you need to back up a little bit more. And I'm going like this, as though you would expand, but you might actually kind of imagine yourself stepping backwards, or you might imagine your feelings coming out onto your knee or something, and your body becomes the bigger containing space. The second part of this finding the right place to start is to check the tone. As we've said before, it's called the focusing attitude, but I'm not using that language today. So just checking the tone of that spaciousness. Does this space have a kind of a softness to it? Perhaps it has at least a little bit of caring about it. And it's odd that space can feel caring. And there might come a kind of a spontaneous, subtle compassion as you just sit with a feeling. The space might begin to feel like it has a compassionate tone to it. So these are kind of subtle, but very significant and profound, but sometimes kind of subtle shifts in tone in the space itself. So it's not a big feeling of caring or sympathy or wanting to help. It's nothing like that. That would no longer be spacious enough. And this is the analogy that I'm using, it's like the way that the sun feels. Like the sun is impersonal to you. In a sense, the sun doesn't care about you, but it feels warm. Its warmth can feel quite caring and quite embracing. It's that kind of quality. It's like this space allows everything. And there's something about that spaciousness itself that has this tone of a little bit of care to it. If what arises in this space is quite vulnerable, then you will feel in response often that the space becomes a little more compassionate. So there's no agenda, no content of its own in this awareness, attention space. So that's the beginning of the relationship, is to bring that kind of, find yourself at the beginning where you can really kind of be that spaciousness towards whatever is there in your experiencing. Yeah, so that's what I'd like us to practice. But first of all, any questions, not questions that come from why I've said what I've said is conceptually or philosophically wrong. Leave that for another time. But if there's any kind of confusion or any feedback or sharing from the more experiential aspect of what I'm saying, let's make sure there's time for that. Just a couple of minutes before we practice. That sounds to me like what sometimes is called a background feeling in focusing, something that's almost always there. You won't be able to focus with that kind of on your back. So I suspect the choices are either to clear a space, to see if just for 5 minutes that feeling would be willing to settle down beside you, to give you a little bit more space inside to go on and focus. Or it could be that that part of you that holds that goal really needs to come from. Yeah. I mean, it's often the case, for me at least, that I'd sit down and I focus, I have some sense what I need to focus on, and something else comes. And no matter what I do, it's just there. And so then I have to give up and say, okay, well, the body is saying this has to come first. So that's where I really need to start. Good, thank you. Anything else before we try a little bit of practice? The feedback after practice is probably more important, but I just want to make sure it's clear up until now. Okay. So I would like to suggest that the practice be really basic. The basic things in our experiencing often can be very profound, and the subtle shifts in understanding can also often be very profound. So I really want to encourage you to kind of slow down and stay with the real simplicity of this. So this is what I'd like to suggest, that in this case, we have pairs and that we have 10 minutes each for each person to focus and to listen. and then 10 minutes of debrief in your pairs. So it would be 30 minutes in your small groups and then back to the main group. So these are my suggestions. To take all the time, all of your 10 minutes, just to bring your attention to yourself. To check that you're able to bring this very open, patient space with no agenda to whatever is there in your body. Keep backing up until you feel that you are the space that is attending to everything that is there. So that's kind of trying to find this place to start from. So when you feel like you can be that kind of open spaciousness, then do nothing. Just sit with your attention on whatever is felt. Just kind of welcoming it, allowing it to be there with that soft, gentle tone, and to do nothing else. Just sit with the space that you create with your attention. And just see how that offers a context or a container for the rest of the feeling process to happen. So the feeling can be quite subtle that you're paying attention to. It might get more and more subtle the more you kind of back up with your space. That's good. Let that happen. It's the kind of, it usually becomes the kind of feeling you could easily ignore. So this is very different to have a feeling like that and to give it 10 minutes. So you just need to be in contact with it. You don't need to feel it as bad or as intense as it usually is. You just need to have some contact with it. So this is the beginning of a relationship between you and all of that, feeling it all at once. Just between you and that whole feeling, the way it is there in its wholeness. Okay, so the listener just reflects back. You might try some of the facilitative language from yesterday. You're noticing that that's there. You're noticing how shy it is. Things like that. You're noticing it, that kind of formulation. You might try that or you might not. If that feels artificial or mechanical, then you don't do it unless the focuser says, could you reflect it back saying, I'm noticing it? If they ask for that, then of course, it's good to offer. But keeping it really simple, it could be 10 minutes of almost complete silence. That would be fun too. Okay? Okay. So, oh great, it's 11:30, so if we come back at 12. Yeah, everyone. Yeah, okay. Okay, so let's just have, maybe 10 minutes or so of feedback, anything you want to share, questions that came up for you, and then we'll have a 10-minute break. And if you want to ask a question, you can use the chat, or you can just unmute yourself and say something. Yes, all I would say is maybe you can. Cool question. It would be interesting to see. Because as soon as you say, be really angry, for example, I mean, I know that if I'm in a situation where I'm feeling angry, it's not actually, I'm not in it though. Yeah, I'm not in it. It's different if I'm in it, it's so that I am the anger, then I can't focus and then I can't even function very well. There is a way of, when you said kind of almost like there's a lot of anger there, there's a way of actually having it all and being able to focus. The words that come can be the words that actually carry forward my experiencing. And it may not feel so much like there's space, but there actually is a spaciousness to it. I'm realizing in my own process, but that's just me. I don't think anyone would want you to lose that. But they aren't felt senses. Orgasm isn't a felt sense. Tears are not a felt sense. Laughter is not a felt sense. But those are very, very important bodily processes. Bodily releases, bodily processes. You can be overwhelmed by grief, and that is actually the grief moving through your body. And then, as it kind of calms again, then you could take a step back and be with all of it, which might be a very useful thing to do, but not necessarily instead of. Felt sense is something that forms. A felt sense can give rise to extremely pleasurable feelings, or can give rise to tears or laughter or felt sense.
Yes, I get that distinction.
So I would say experiment with it.
Yeah.
Just experiment with it and see if it does experientially feel different to you, the coming of tears and where the tears come from, for example, and they may not. And you may not want to use the term felt sense at all. To use the term, Chandler uses that term very specifically, but you may not want to use that term. You might want to use a term that fits whatever the experience is that you're having, and you might define felt sense so that it fits that. Or you might want to use the term experiencing, felt sensing, feeling, or the bodily release that comes along. A bodily release often comes with an expressiveness that is extremely important. And you might want to say that that's not distinct from the felt sense, that is, it's all, in some way, it's all one. I guess I have a couple of responses. I feel we're maybe in danger of, at least maybe I'm in danger of moving too far away from experience in how I'm responding. I would say if we use just one of those many examples, the example of laughter or crying, one of those, they're quite common in focusing that something like that will happen. The coming of laughter that is actually a shift in the felt sense, I think, and maybe this is your point, is quite different than a laughter that is kind of a distraction from or a batting away of what we're actually experiencing, almost like a laughing at ourselves. So I think the coming of these bodily releases and bodily feelings, I think we can discern, is this part of the process, or is this a way of kind of backing away from the process? Is it a way of making space in the process? Is it a kind of bodily release that then brings us to a different relationship with the whole experiencing? I think we each of us needs to just discern that. Like, what is this? What is this that's happening? And see what answers we each come up with. Gendlin does make a distinction between the felt sense and emotion and sensation. I think we need to each decide whether that's an important distinction or not. It may not be, or sometimes it might be, and sometimes it might not be. I wouldn't want necessarily his distinction to get in the way of my own experiencing. If it's helpful in my experiencing, then I like to have it there. If it isn't helpful, then I'm happy to put it to one side. So anything else before we take a 10-minute break? Okay, so let's take 10 minutes. It's 17 past, so at 12:27, if we come back and feel free to jump around, roll around, water your plants, or do something, and then we'll carry on. So people are just asking about the notes and the recording, and yes to both of those. Little edited bits of the recording are accessible on the news part of the website, but the full recording is in the student section of the web page. Those will be uploaded when we can do that. Editing out any interaction, so you just get the teaching part of it. Okay, so let's go on. Because we only have an hour, we're going to have a little bit less time for practice, unfortunately. And also I will edit a little bit of what I wanted to say. So this part is about deepening the connection. So it's kind of adding a little bit more flesh to the facilitative language session that we had recently. Yeah, so the first thing is that being in relationship with a bodily feeling is the same as paying attention to an object in your room, for example. You invite your attention to that object, and then you look at it as an object, intending to see it as it is, not with all of your associations, your memories, your interpretations, your preconceptions laid on top of it. And it can feel quite exciting to see an everyday object freshly, just like it can feel quite exciting to turn your attention towards your experiencing and actually enter into a fresh connection with something that you're maybe quite familiar with but never quite pay attention to. You can have that sense of excitement. So in focusing, we bring our whole attention to a bodily feeling, but rather than relate to it as an object, we open up to it as if it's another subject, as if it has its own point of view, a life of its own, something to inform us about. And oddly, in just giving it the space and relating to it as if it's alive, it often kind of wakes up and seems to take on a life of its own. It seems to have already within it a process of change. We don't need to make it change. So when we're focusing, we need to pause until we feel we are actually in relationship with the feeling. Like you would, this is just an analogy, like you would with a child that you're in an important conversation with. First, you offer your full attention to the child until you feel that you get their attention in return. That takes time. It doesn't happen immediately. And when it does happen, it usually feels at least a little bit more alive, kind of meeting that child eye to eye. Similarly, the body kind of wakes up a bit because there is that genuine contact. And sometimes it feels almost as if from the felt sense, it's like, oh, you're looking at me. Finally, you're noticing me. It can have that kind of quality to it. Yeah, and from yesterday, you have the language of reflecting that as the focuser you can use, or as a listener you can use, that it's like a part of me is being noticed. It's like something in me is coming alive. It's like it feels more attended to. I'm noticing it in some way. I'm noticing it. But of course, again, this is an it that's like a subject, not an it that's like an object, not something to be controlled or manipulated. So again, we sense the quality of the relationship. This feels like an important part to me. What kind of relationship does the felt sense need? What kind of relationship does it need from me? And can I offer that? It often needs patience, genuine care, understanding. Sometimes it needs to feel loved. Those sorts of things often come up. Sometimes it also needs strength. It might need to sense your stability before it opens up and shows more of itself. It might need to sense someone who will stand up for it, a protector, something like that. So you can check, what kind of relationship does it need from me? And what would let it know that it's getting that kind of relationship from me? If you sense that it's like a scared animal and it needs to be able to trust you, sense into the feeling, what would let it trust me? What has to happen here so that it does actually sense it's getting the trust it needs? So it gets much more exact. What exactly does it need from me so that it knows it's getting what it needs? It's not enough to just say to it, you can trust me. That probably won't work. So what kind of interaction is needed here? And what would let it know that it's getting that from me, if I can give it? And you will probably notice it's a different kind of interaction or relationship than it usually gets from you and probably from other people often as well. Yeah. So there's two other aspects of the relationship that I would like to suggest can be important, not always. One is it too close? Are you sensing that you're almost at that point of merging with the felt sense or in danger of being overwhelmed by it? Are you losing that sense of presence, that sense of I and an it, so that you're almost becoming it? If so, it can be very useful to just step back in your awareness, finding that starting place again. So you're far enough away that you can kind of feel it all at once, but there still is a sense of you attending to it. One way of checking that is when you're focusing is just to ask into the whole process, does this feel okay? And that means, does it feel okay for the felt sense? Is it getting what it needs? And does it feel okay with me as the person who's attending to the feeling? Does this actually feel like an okay relationship, an okay interaction? And the second thing is, if sometimes it can feel too distant rather than too close. In this case, you may no longer even feel your body, or you may feel that there's just a big blank there. It's almost like you're more dissociated rather than disidentified. So disidentified means you can have a sense of it and a sense of you, so there can be a relationship. Dissociated means almost like you've gone away or it's gone away. Sometimes it means you've gone into your thinking and you simply need to invite your attention back into your body. And again, what often is helpful is to check the tone of your attention. Sometimes it's too distant because there's something that's crept into your tone, the kind of attention you're giving. Sometimes just staying with that kind of a blank that occasionally comes and just practicing having that kind of spacious, slightly caring kind of atmosphere around it is enough for something eventually to come, something that maybe is really quite timid. Another thing that you could try if it feels okay to try this, of course, is to say down into the body with a kind of an exaggeration. You can say things like, this is something that Jen used to often suggest. Oh, so this is all solved now. This is completely okay. I don't feel anything about this anymore. Often those kinds of more exaggerated things, it's like it invites something to come. I go, well, no, not exactly. There is still something here. And then if something comes, don't pounce on it. Just kind of really gently welcome it to come a little bit more. So the listener, and this is what was spoken about recently in the other workshop. What can the listener do to support these aspects of right relationship? The listener can reflect the kind of relationship that's implied, even if it wasn't said. And we saw Jen do that in the demonstration on Friday. You can sense for the relationship from the felt senses point of view. For example, if the focuser says, it's like it's just silently looking at me. As the listener, you might say back, what the focuser said, I would suggest always say that back first, like it's silently looking. Maybe just taking time to assess the situation. That's something you could add. It's almost like what's implied in that looking. Or maybe like it's waiting to see if it's okay or something. Again, these are just sensing into what's implied from the felt senses point of view in this relationship, pointing to the tone, the pace, the space that the felt sense seems to be requesting. And always offering it very tentatively, so it's very easy for the focuser to bat it away if it doesn't fit. So this is kind of emphasizing the edge of what is happening, the kind of the potential movement that's implied in the feeling. It's very good to reflect back when there's even a little movement or shift that could get skipped over by the focuser. It's good to just notice that and reflect it back to the focuser. And let your voice reflect the kind of relationship that the felt sense is longing for. So let that tone of gentleness or strength or whatever get into your voice in a sincere way. Like you're wanting the felt sense to hear it from you and you're reflecting. You want the felt sense to know in your reflection that you've picked up on the tone it's needing. And the listener can use that kind of language we've been talking about. You're aware of it. You can feel that place that isn't going to just let that happen again. It's letting you know what it needs from you. You. So in this way, both the focuser and the listener are attending to the quality of the inner relationship. And I think we've covered that. I don't need to say that stuff again necessarily. As the listener, you might notice, and listeners often would notice this, if the focuser has started to do something to the feeling rather than just be with it. It's easy to slip into that. I mean, very, very experienced focusers still slip into that. Then you can offer very tentative relational reminders that treat the feeling with care and respect, almost like another person or entity who is still trying to find their voice in order to say something difficult that it thinks maybe nobody even wants to hear. So the focuser could say, I'm just telling it that I need it to stand up for itself. You can hear in that that's not the focusing attitude. The focuser is telling it something rather than listening to it. So the listener We always say yes to what's happening. We don't argue with the focuser. You might just say yes. You're wanting to let it know how important it is to stand up for itself. And you might also want to just sense what it's wanting. So you're just kind of reminding that you might also want to just sense for the felt senses point of view rather than what you're wanting for it. So there's all of these things that we're not doing. We're not telling it how to be. We're not telling it what it should want. We're not telling it what it's all about, the felt sense. We're not telling it it will be okay. We're not telling it to calm down. We're not trying to fix it. We're not analyzing it. We're not interpreting it. We're not bringing in, at least during the session, our concepts and theories, though afterwards you might wonder about those things. So everything that can cause trouble in a relationship with another person can also get in the way of this inner relationship. What helps a relationship develop interpersonally can also help one form between you and your felt experience. It's not always easy to offer the kind of interaction that's needed. Often we end up repeating the kind of interactions that we ourselves got but didn't need. Unfortunately, that often happens. Sadly, we often repeat an unhelpful environment that we learned earlier in life. So just watch for that. And that's where the listener can be really helpful. That's where the listener's unconditional positive regard can be very healing and very helpful. Okay. So I'm wondering if there's any quick questions before we go and practice this and find our own sense of some of the things I've been pointing to, because you might have a very different sense of it. You're absolutely right. I say the felt sense. If I was going to be more accurate, I would be saying felt sensing. Felt sensing could include, there could be much more than one felt sense there. There can be a feeling about the feeling. You're right. It can be more complicated. Definitely.
Okay.
Like that example I gave. I gave one example of where the focuser says, I'm just telling it that I need it to stand up for itself. As a listener, you will notice that that's not the kind of relationship that's probably most helpful in focusing. So you could reflect that back. You're wanting to let it know how important it is to stand up for itself. So that's the reflection. But then you might offer this reminder. You might also want to just sense, what is it wanting? So that's an example where, as the listener, you're reminding the focuser of this kind of environment that's very open, has no agenda. Is useful to you, if it would get in the way to express it, and just to silently have the relationship inside of yourself, if that's most helpful, of course, do that. If saying it out loud so your listener knows what you're doing inside feels more important, it's like you're keeping the listener very close with you, then do that. Experiment with these things and see what works. And what works one time won't necessarily work the next time. In some interactions, I might just go, I might just be silent. In other interactions, I might just reflect it back. You're letting it know that you will just sit with it quietly for a while. So it depends. And that's what the debrief is for, is to check afterwards. Was it helpful that I said that, or would you have preferred I hadn't said something? A lot of the learning can come from that. I would like to encourage you to practice really attending to the relationship allowing it to slowly develop. The focuser can sense if it feels like it's in a kind of a right relationship, whatever right means to you, if you're a bit too distant, a bit too close. And if you're providing the kind of the quality of interaction that's needed. Like sensing with the felt sense, what does this part of me really need from me? How does it need me to be with it? And then what would show it that I'm doing that? What exactly does it need to experience so that it knows it is getting that care or that trust or whatever? As the listener, really tune in especially to that inner relationship that's developing between the focuser and the felt sense. And maybe experiment a little bit, like we were saying, in ways of reflecting that relationship. What's going on between the focuser and the felt sense. And maybe even sensing a little bit about what the felt sense, what's implied in the way the felt sense needs it to be, even if that hasn't been said yet by that focuser. But offering things very tentatively so that they're very easy to correct or refine if they're not quite right. Okay? So I think 12 minutes each, 10-minute debrief, and unfortunately we'll only have a few minutes then when we come back to the main group. Okay, so we only have a couple of minutes. I'd like to go, I'm sorry about the timings, I'd like to go 5 minutes over just so there's a little bit more space for people to feedback if you want to. And if anybody needs to leave on time, of course, please do that. And I have shared the notes in the chat, so you should be able to download it from there. Okay, so any kind of... Good, thank you, I'm glad to hear that. We're beginning to introduce this. We'll practice it a little bit more as we go along, but it doesn't mean that you have to do it. And you may well be in a session where it would be totally inappropriate. So I suspect, Rob, your sense that you couldn't quite fit it in a way that felt right, that you probably did the right thing by not doing it. So ready to let you know that it came quite quickly. Yeah, I mean, I'd like to say two things in response. One is everything that I say can be wrong, and especially in any particular moment. It could be that what is right is the opposite of what I've said. And the other thing I would say is if it does feel like it came quickly, sometimes it's useful just to check it. Just to kind of slow down and check, like, is that really what it's wanting? Is that really what's needed? And that can help.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so I just want to note that there's a couple of messages here, things about putting things up on the website, blah, 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 but also from Fred, a question: do you work on the relationship when everything is fine or only when this gets stuck? Interesting question. I would say that the quality of the relationship that is needed is already implicitly there, even if things are going well. It sometimes is worthwhile to notice it. Just to notice that the felt sense is really enjoying this honest, compassionate, or open attention it's getting from me. Just to notice that sometimes takes it even a little bit deeper, even if there's no problem there.